Big sweat patches? No, I'm good.
You'll be pleased to hear that I just hit record as you was like,
It's like what, 28 degrees here?
oh, it's like 32 down here. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's fucking.
Anyway, I think that's the best icebreaker to a video we could possibly have.
Just like, fuck, it's sweaty pits.
Welcome to the Soviet Reenactor podcast with me, Francis Pullum.
And me, Jordan Lyle.
And I think the first episode went down quite well, and I personally really enjoyed doing that. So let's continue, I suppose.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. I mean, I learned quite a lot, and I thought it was quite fun. To sit down and do the research, and actually get stuck into doing some proper history.
Yeah. Really getting your mitts on like real history and explaining it. It's with the reenacting season gone out the window, this is the best opportunity we're really going to get, and it's nice, really, really nice.
Yeah, but I think we're getting to scratch both our itches.
So. Exactly. Today we're going to be doing things a little bit differently than last time, in the sense of the first subject we're going to talk about is very historical based, and the other subject we're going to talk about is more about the reenacting side of things. Coming at this as the Soviet Reenactors podcast, it would seem silly just to focus just on like history and talk about a little bit like why we do reenactments as Soviets and what's it like to be a Soviet reenactor. So I think we're going to have quite an interesting discussion from both the history side and the reenacting side today.
Yeah, like I said, I'm looking forward to it. A nice little open chat.
Well, I mean, I went first last time, so I think it's only fair that you go first this time. So, what are we talking about today?
So, as I'm sure whoever's actually read the title of what's going to be the video, what I'm going to be talking about today is going to be the history and use of Soviet airborne forces, and including a little paragraph on naval airborne forces of the Black Sea Fleet. So.
And that's something that, like straight off the bat, I have absolutely no clue on. So you're really, choosing those subjects early that I'm just sitting here like, right, teach me. I need to know this stuff.
I think that's the best part about these chats is the fact that we can share information. I mean, the vast majority, it's taken me quite some time to piece together all this information. I had to sift through 4 different books and internet sources to just come up with what I want to talk about today. And it really is a fascinating subject, and funnily enough, and it's totally unprepared, but today is actually the 90th anniversary of the foundation of the Soviet Airborne Forces. It's VDB Day. So.
Oh, well, happy birthday, the Soviet Airborne Forces. Jeez, I mean,
yeah.
I can't think of a better birthday present, to be honest with you. Like 2 history nerds sitting down and just so happen to be discussing it.
I know.
So yeah, once we've talked about Soviet Airborne Forces, we'll move on to my topic, which will be the public perception of Soviet reenactors. So that's going to be a little less formal. We're just going to sit here and talk about our personal experiences, the sort of things that people say to us, and ask us why we do it, and a little bit about why we decided to be Soviets. So, to be honest with you, I think without further ado, I want to know about these airborne troops. You've been hinting at it all week, and I'm really looking forward to getting some good bits of information.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've been reading about researching this for quite some time, and I've had an interest in it for a couple of years now. So let's hit the bat. So it kind of starts off in 1911 when a parachute designer in the Russian Empire called G.E. Kontolenikov would start to develop the first parachutes in Russia. These would be made and designed by him, and they would not see much adoption at all. The Russian Imperial Air Service, quite like the Western and the Central Powers, decided that it would be cowardly and not worth the effort to equip pilots with parachutes. They didn't see any use for them. However, post-war and going into the Civil War, they would start to see adoption by the Soviet military, but not for pilots. Again, pilots would still be screwed if they got shot down. They would instead get used by balloon observer balloon crews instead. By 1922, Soviet sports parachuting would become quite popular, especially in the urban areas of the USSR. Even at the Osovai-Kim, the paramilitary sports society, would actually introduce sports parachuting as a sport into their agenda in 1933. And again, it proved to be extremely popular in built-up cities where children, adults, teenagers could get a turn at jumping from these static platforms built in cities that look like electric pylons. And like I said, it proved to be extremely popular with children.
It's definitely quite the thrill-seeking adrenaline thing, core.
Yeah, I mean, if you didn't want to just go shooting or pet horses, you could go and become a parachutist.
You could shoot a gun while petting a horse while on a parachute.
And ride a mountain and climb a mountain at the same time.
That's what you do when you get to the top. You jump off with the parachute on a horse with a gun.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that and also by Kim, sports activities would also play an integral part to consumal members, as they would need to actually adopt one of these sports and practice at least one of them in order to qualify becoming a consumal member and to hold it. The first idea of armed soldiers being deployed by parachute would actually come as early as 1927.
Wow.
So, and it would be quite the unorthodox use of them. It's not against, formal opposing forces, but instead a small group of parachutists armed would actually drop into Central Asia to dispose of some bandits. And they would dispose of several groups of bandits in that area. So yeah.
That's quite, when you think about it, that's very clever. Very, very clever,
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, infrastructure at that time in Central Asia and Siberia would be effectively nothing. So being able to actually descend from the sky from some flying machine.
It's almost like a modern day tactical airdrop, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very clever.
Yeah, exactly. And by 1930, they would start to introduce the first official military exercises. And in 1930, they would carry over 550 jumps south of Moscow just in the 1 year, which is quite insane. And during this period, they would essentially practice everything from night jumps to what they effectively can get away with, and different methods. As at this moment in time, it was still a brand new idea, and they're still experimenting with it.
Yeah.
And in 1931, they would then be used again in a similar role to what they were using in 1927, to block a retreat path of a group of Basmuch bandits who were in active hostilities with the Soviet Union at the time. So a group of 15 parachuters armed with pistols and some rifles, and one MG. However, I haven't been able to find out if it was a HMG or a LMG. I assume a small degtier. I say small, but a degtier, as I don't see a Maxim getting chucked out quite easily.
Definitely not.
Yeah, and again, these anti-bandit missions were proven to be quite successful. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, it's like what we'd see today with like tactical use of air forces to, insert your soldiers exactly where you want them. I mean, obviously with the older technology, it's not as precise, but it's way more efficient than sending out search parties to find where they're going to be. If you can fly around, find them, drop your guys in, yeah, it makes so much sense.
Yeah, well, these bandits would be expert horsemen as well, and they would know the area indefinitely. So being able to, like I said before, being able to chuck men out of some magic flying machine that these bandits have probably never even seen a plane before, never mind seeing men drop from them, and these men not dying when they jump out of this flying machine from this great height, and now the men are shooting at them, like, they're probably taken by quite some surprise.
Yes, that would surprise me.
Yeah, it certainly would surprise me, especially if someone just parachuted into my back garden. So yeah, following on from that, the following year would see the first formal test detachment being established, the first unit, if you get me.
Yeah.
And it would quickly find itself growing to the size of a small brigade. And following on from that, you would get several airborne corps being formed. This would largely down to the infamous and famous Mikhail Tukhachevsky.
My hero. I do love Tukhachevsky.
Yeah. And as he was quite the supporter and primary supporter of a lot of specialised revolutionary military tactics, such as parachuting, mountain troops.
He was a big proponent of war in depth, which you can sort of see as the Soviet version of Blitzkrieg as well.
Yeah. So again, when Mikhail fell out of favour with Mr. Stalin, he took a lot of his supporters with him. And the Airborne Corps would see quite a big impact on this. However, they would still be quite popular, and they wouldn't get as badly affected as some specialised branches like the mountain divisions. They would still see quite a bit of autonomy.
So, just out of curiosity, so are these airborne troops, are they attached to the army, or are they attached to the Air Force, or are they their own separate entity in that sense?
At this point, they are part of the army.
Okay.
To my knowledge, they're part of the army. However, they are dressed in Air Force regalia, so you would have Air Force collar tabs and unit identifying marks. However, I could be wrong about that. However, later, as I'll touch on, they would get formed into their own independent branch. So then that's where they would fall under the VDV.
Okay.
So the first actual combat use of paratroopers would be or Soviet paratroopers, sorry, would be at Khalkhin Gol, actually, and they wouldn't be used in their traditional airborne role, but again, just as ground troops. Where the 212th Airborne Brigade got used as shock troops quite effectively against the Japanese, and they inflicted massive casualties.
So were these guys? Sorry, were these guys quite elite then? Were they specifically good soldiers, kind of like how we see the SAS as a particularly impressive branch?
At the time. They were definitely the best trained soldiers in the Red Army. Not only that, they would get paid a lot better. They get better rations, and they had that distinction of being able to say, "Oh yeah, I'm a paratrooper. I'm part of the newest, coolest branch that the military has." And their training regime was a lot longer and more intensive than the standard infantryman. So after Khalkhin Gol, they would also be used in the Finnish War, where they've performed the Winter War, where they would get used as part of the Petsamo, probably butchering that, offensive, and they perform their first combat jumps there. That, however, would also not just be that, oh, this is the first combat jump, but it would also be their first black mark in their history, where they would see tremendously high casualties. which would go on to become quite a trademark of Soviet airborne operations for days to come following.
Yeah.
Finnish tactics, along with poor navigation and bad weather, would prove to be quite the detriment to the Soviet airborne forces fighting in Finland. However, when they weren't being employed in the larger fighting roles and the larger jump sizes, when they're employed in small detachments to perform sabotage missions and raids behind Finnish lines, they would prove to be astonishingly effective. So you would actually see them performing better as sort of pseudo commandos than paratroopers.
Right.
Just with the Finnish tactics that would be applied to them.
So during the Winter War, I don't suppose you know that did they wear any sort of white uniform? Because as far as I'm aware, like the Red Army wore their sort of winter green twill cotton wool tunics, and I just can't imagine these paratroopers jumping down in the winter, being scattered as they would, and then essentially being green silhouettes across the battlefield. I mean, that was the very first thing that sprung to my mind.
Well, for the Winter War, I'm not actually too sure. They would definitely be seen wearing their white oversuits in the Vyazma offensive when it comes to the Battle of Moscow. Technically the Battle of Rzhev. But yeah, they would definitely be jumping in something similar.
Wow. No wonder they had such high casualties.
Overcoats. And they would also have quite a special winter uniform made for them later on when it gets to the battle, the Vyazma operation, where it's essentially kind of like an early fur-lined Afghanka that you would see Soviets using later on in the invasion of Afghanistan.
Right.
I'll try and find some pictures for you.
Yeah.
For you to have a look and put up by. Where? Here we go.
Sorry, I keep on distracting with my questions.
Yeah, sorry, it's okay. The invasion of
Bessarabia? Bukovina?
Yeah. So the invasion of Bessarabia, the invasion of Bessarabia in June 1940 would see the 3 Airborne Brigades, the 201st, 204th and 214th Airborne Brigades, jump from a total of 170 Tb3 Heavy Bombers.
Wow.
Lovely planes.
Oh, I love them to death. Absolutely do.
Yeah. And they would capture, their objective would be the cities of Volgograd, Kagul and Izmail. And they would capture all 3 within the same days of landing.
Wow.
All 3 cities would be captured and seized by the afternoon of the exact same day.
That's really impressive.
Yeah, it did help that there wasn't any opposition.
Oh, okay.
There wasn't any remaining troops fighting in the area. In fact, paratroopers and commanders would actually regard the operation as less of a combat jump and more as a more realistic pre-war exercise, rather than a combat jump.
Yeah.
However, it was a very good opportunity for them to actually perform in their assigned roles.
Wow.
Yeah. By the time of the Soviet invasion, Wehrmacht invasion, or Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet airborne forces would play quite a vital role in quite a lot of offensives and encirclements. And this would come out to their detriment, this would come out to effectively be their decimation. And for one example, by June 1941, the 5 airborne corps that were formed would be fully manned and trained with paratroopers. However, they would lack quite a lot of the heavy equipment. And say heavy equipment, you're thinking paratroopers. Why would paratroopers have heavy equipment? They're meant to be paratroopers. Well, at that time, Soviet airborne corps were meant to have T-38 tanks attached to them.
Okay.
separate battalions. Yeah, so they have to have a mix of T-38 and T-37 light tanks, which I might touch on further in the future. And they were also missing quite a lot of their radio sets as well. So their heavier equipment along those lines were pretty much non-existent, effectively.
To be honest with you as well, I mean, I know what you mean by heavy equipment, but T-37s and T-38s are not that great either. So perhaps it was a good thing they didn't have them to hand.
They're not really, are they? Yeah, I'd love to take a T-37 out against a Panzer II, but it's rapid fire 20mm.
Yes. Well, I would in the sense of I'd love to ride around in one, but I wouldn't because I wouldn't last that long.
Yeah, exactly. So as the situation would turn quite dire for the Soviets, there'd be quite a few small-scale, sort of battalion-level, smaller parachute drops would be conducted to stall enemy advances and to relieve encircled troops and to help provide breakout opportunities to provide reinforcements to areas. However, they would be swept aside for most of these smaller jumps. They would be deployed on essentially every front at the start of the invasion, from Odessa all the way up to Leningrad, the Baltic coast. However, they would be consolidated down into smaller fronts. One prominent use of them would be in the Battle of Kiev, where the 3rd Airborne Corps, based at Giuliani Airfield, which still exists as Giuliani Airport in Kiev today, was about to be attacked by German forces. And the German reconnaissance units, when they were just about to be attacked, they noted down that the Germans thought they were being attacked by pilots from the airfield, because they saw these men advancing towards them, admittedly quite a rapid pace, and quite well armed men with flying helmets and flying jumpsuits. So the scouts just wrote down, oh yeah, we're getting attacked by pilots. However, these pilots would turn out to be the parachuters in the 3rd Airborne Corps, and they would actually push the Germans who were on the attack back well over 12 miles.
Wow.
They would take quite a lot of seriously heavy casualties doing that. However, they would also inflict tremendously high casualties during this assault. And they would also play quite a critical part in keeping the Kiev pocket open, and also for the further breakout, which would essentially see the 3rd Airborne Corps being turned to nothing, really. There wouldn't be many survivors coming out of that. They would eventually go on for a series of amalgamations onto being the 13th Guards, which is the unit that I portray. My reenacting group. So, by the winter of 1941, the Wehrmacht was beating on the doors of Moscow, and the situation was looking quite grim for the Red Army. By this time, they were planning a counterattack. The Germans had stalled in their advance, and the Stavka were looking for a way to exploit the Germans' loss of momentum and for the Soviets to actually gain some. So, round out Moscow in December 1941, the 214th Airborne Brigade, which was used in the Romanian invasion prior, actually had a very, very successful jump in December. And they would go on in this admittedly small-scale jump of a brigade, of a battalion. But that single battalion of the 214th would go on to destroy 29 bridges, 2 tanks, and up to 400 infantry in a space of 9 days. Yeah,
pretty impressive. Yeah, jeez.
Yeah, I mean it's quite a common factor when you're looking into the history of the Soviet airborne forces. They do take quite a beating, but they also give it out as well.
Wow.
By January, the Stavka came up with an idea to force the Germans away from Moscow. And they came up with an opportunity to encircle Army Group Centre. Wanted to encircle Army Group Centre and wipe it out and win the war. So they came up with the idea of launching an airborne operation near the town of Vyazma, in between Moscow and Smolensk. And this airborne operation actually fall part of the Rzhev meat grinder, which I'm sure you know quite a bit about. Yeah. So that would go on to become quite a brutal, long-lasting battle.
Perhaps it's something we could actually cover, because it's one of those things that the Battle of Stalingrad really takes, like most historians, like, oh, this is what happened in 42, but as you say, most people forget that the Moscow sector was just as active.
Oh yeah, if not more.
Yeah,
if not more so.
Yeah. But anyway, yes.
I mean, the Rzhev meat grinder didn't even come out in a clear winner. I mean, the amount of sacrifice that happened there, and it ended in a stalemate.
Yeah.
Where no side could actually benefit from. So where was I? Let's went back 2 seconds. So starting from the 18th of January to 20th of February, over 7,373 paratroopers would take part in the operation to land near the area of Vyazma. The main goal, like I mentioned, would be to block the reinforcement of Army Group Centre and prevent Army Group Centre from retreating. This would perform 3 main tasks to accomplish this. To capture the main railway line at Vyazma, which was quite a large railway hub. It also had quite a lot of highways running past it and through it. So the idea was to destroy railway lines, destroy the highways, and inflict as much logistical trouble as possible.
Yeah.
The next objective for them was to support the breakthrough of the 1st Guards Cavalry Corps, which had broken through the Army Group Centre's lines and actually managed to make it into their rear. The final objective of them would be to link up with the massive amount of partisans operating in the area. The Smolensk area and Vyazma would actually be known as quite a hive of partisan activity.
Yeah.
And that point will actually become one of the driving factors of Soviet airborne forces to go in the future.
Okay.
Yeah, so the 4th Airborne Corps would drop and suffer heavy casualties even before even leaving the plains, as they would get ambushed in the air by German fighters. So you'd have Me-109s coming across these slow and not nimble and fairly aging Tb3 bombers.
Were they still using Tb3s?
Oh yeah.
Bloody hell! Yeah, no, they were. They were dog meat.
This is just at 1941, and they're still using Tb3s. Okay. These
Yeah.
are still the main parachute transport aircraft that they have. And that I'll make a joke about it later as we're getting there, but I'll come back. I'll haunt them effectively. There would also be further complications, including worsening weather and the fact that the pilots were very good at navigating in blizzards. And most of the paratroopers would be spread across gigantic areas. By the 1st of February, only around 1,320 paratroopers had managed to reform into fighting units. Stragglers would either be killed by German forces or join up with partisan groups in the area.
Yeah.
By mid-February, we would see the encirclement of Army Group Centre failing and the Vyazma operation effectively going down the levee, as they would now become the ones encircled along with the 1st Guards Cavalry. Stavka, by this point, would proceed to, instead of cancelling the operation, decided to try and stick with it and commit the 2 remaining Airborne Brigades of the 4th Corps and land them in the area. This was to reinforce the troops already at Vyazma. With the troops enveloped by the Germans would conduct very, very, very aggressive anti-paratrooper, anti-partisan operations, which would prove to be extremely effective. However, they would also take quite a lot of casualties and divert quite a lot of resources away from the front lines. So yeah, after a failed attempt to break through to the 50th Army on the 28th of February, most of these troops would be involved in this brutal fight in sub-zero conditions. So I imagine it's pretty cold jumping out of a plane with all the winds blasting you in the face, but try doing it at -20, -30. I don't imagine it being particularly fun.
I'm all right, thanks.
So, however, on the night of the 26th of May, so these troops started dropping in January. So the first paratroopers were there in January. It's now the end of May, the 26th of May. Combined force of paratroopers, cavalrymen, and partisans would eventually manage to break through to the 10th Army north of Kirov. And on the night of the 27th and 28th of June, we're in June now, the remainder of the Corps would reach 10th Army positions. So that's over 5 months of brutal fighting in the enemy's rear.
Wow.
During that time, they would go on to free over 200 villages, and they would actually go on to hold many of these villages. They would remain loyal to partisans. They would march over 600 kilometres and managed to tie down 7 German infantry divisions, 4 army corps, and inflict serious casualties to the Germans during this operation.
I mean, yeah, when you look at it that way, while their initial objectives were a complete failure, they utterly succeeded in just harassing and tying down and preventing the Germans from working efficiently. So, yeah, it's quite amazing.
Yeah, they definitely did sow havoc whilst they were operating in the rear. However, not all the paratroopers would actually have left Vyazma at that point. Quite a lot of them would still be in the enemy's rear, with the partisan units that still remained in the Vyazma sector. So later on, they would hopefully be rescued.
Yeah.
So out of the roughly 10,000 planned to drop into Vyazma, only around 4,000 would survive.
Wow.
So that's quite a high attrition rate. However, considering that's 5 months of fighting of 1 airborne corps versus 7 divisions and 4 army corps of the Germans, that's pretty good going, I would say, especially when you take into account the conditions that they were fighting in.
Yeah, 100%. That's really
many of the
quite impressive.
paratroopers who survived the operation would see themselves stranded, remaining with partisan forces until they were relieved by advancing forces in March 1943.
Wow, blimey. So
so
over a year,
jumping,
some of these people were
imagine spending a year on an airborne operation. So
I hope their pay was all up to date.
They would be effectively the veterans of the Airborne Corps.
Yeah, amazing.
So the high success of seeing how an Airborne Corps could fight as elite infantry in the early days of the war at Kiev and other engagements proved to the Stavka that, hold on, maybe we're on the defensive here. We are just barely holding the line. We don't need paratroopers. We need elite infantry on the ground fighting. These guys have had superior training, and they have been performing exceptionally in that role.
Yeah.
So the Staff Car would convert the remaining airborne corps into Guards rifle divisions.
Okay.
And many of these would actually take part in the Battle of Stalingrad. So they performed quite admirably there.
Yeah.
However, new airborne divisions were still being formed out of newly trained personnel, instructors, and some veterans. Not a lot, but some. These divisions would mostly fight as elite shock troops, shock infantry, and would not be used in their intended role. So the vast majority of the newly formed Guards airborne divisions would not be used as paratroopers. They would see some parachute jumps later on when we get to 1945. However, they wouldn't get to fulfill their intended role. But they would fight very well in their infantry role.
Wow.
With the retreat of German forces from the Rzhev salient, that would also see a largest number of paratrooper veterans who had dropped into the Vyazma operation being recovered after living with the partisans for over a year at that point. The veterans would be used to form 3 special airborne brigades. The 1st, 3rd, and Guards Airborne Brigades. These would be held in reserve for future parachute operations. As by 1943, Stavka had came up with, they've started to realise that, hold on, we're going to be advancing further behind German lines. We're on the assault now. Hopefully, we can have the opportunity to exploit some use out of these Guards Airborne Brigades. The 1st and 3rd Brigades would actually be mostly composed of 40 to 50% veterans of the Vyazma operation. So the 1st and 3rd Brigade, so the 1st and 3rd Brigade would be pretty nails, as we would call it. And they would get to cut their teeth quite significantly in 1943. As I mentioned, with the tides of war turning and the liberation of Ukraine well underway, the Red Army's advance to the Dnieper River, which would provide a quite significant natural obstacle for the Red Army and their advance, and quite a large defensive line for the Germans. The Stavka needed a way to help breach this area. By late September, the Germans would be behind the Dnieper River, and Stavka would consider plans how to best create and expand the bridgehead and how to continue the momentum of the advance. South of Kiev, if you follow the Dnieper River south, I'll get a screenshot to show you. So if you go from Kiev and follow the river south, you'll see quite a prominent bend where the river essentially goes and juts out and comes back along. This bend was regarded as lightly defended by the recon and partisan forces that were in the area. However, they would kind of fall victim to their own success. Soviet forces would be able to cross into this area. And the only troops in the area during the initial limited crossing of the Soviet troops would be the 24th Panzer Corps, which was still in the process of withdrawing across the river themselves. So you'd have half their forces split from one side of the river to the other.
Yeah.
On the 22nd, like I mentioned, the Soviet ground forces would cross the Dnieper at quite several points across the bend. To counter this, the Germans, seeing that the Soviets are crossing the Dnieper, they would reinforce the area with the 19th Panzer Division, the 112th and 34th Infantry Divisions. So this lightly defended area is becoming quite significantly defended by this point. Wanting to capitalise on their success, the Stavka would decide to launch an airborne operation in late September. So the crossing happens on the 22nd. and as soon as the crossing happens, they're starting to consider, okay, we want to exploit this, we need an airborne operation now.
Yeah.
So they started to hastily prepare an operation to exploit this, using the 3 Guards Airborne Brigades that were formed mostly of the ASMA veterans. Many of the planes that were planned for this operation would not show up on time. The Soviet air fleet's heavy task of resupplying partisans across the entire front line and its generic transport tasks of ferrying troops and ammunition from point A to point B would affect the organisation of the transport planes quite significantly.
Yeah.
So they had the idea of using 180 planes and 32 gliders for the drop. However, the night before the drop, only 8 planes would be available and arrive at the designated drop start off airfields. However, planes would arrive through the night and start to eventually build up. However, like a haunting spectre, most of these planes wouldn't be the newish Douglas Lee 2 transport aircraft, which was a licensed copy of the DC-3. Instead, they would face their old friend, the Tb3 Heavy Bomber.
Oh
so
dear.
This is late 1943, and they're still using the Tb3 for parachute operations.
Yeah, no. Corrugated coffins at that point, let's be honest.
Yeah, pretty much.
Christ.
Yeah, so by the morning of the 24th, so this is the day that everything's meant to happen. The troops are going to land late in the evening of the 24th September above one of the aerodromes that the paratroopers are meant to be starting to take off from. An air raid siren would sound, and a Luftwaffe plane, some say it was bomber, some say it was transport aircraft, would appear overhead. Just one solitary plane. It didn't drop any bombs, however, it did drop leaflets. These leaflets read that the German forces were waiting on them, and they were wanting to give them a warm reception and telling them to hurry up.
Wow.
So yeah, not getting off to the best start.
No.
To add on to this, most of the paratroopers and junior level commanders didn't even know what their objectives were for when they landed. And even some of them still thought it was a training exercise. They didn't think that they were actually going into a live drop. So
yes, this has got the hallmarks of a fantastic mission all over it. Like, yeah, no.
yeah, so the Nipper operation is going to be, spoiler alert, is going to be a complete disaster, essentially. However, they will still kind of succeed. So by 5:30 on the 24th of September, the 5th Guards Airborne Brigades, this was the Airborne Brigade that didn't have many veterans in it, it was mostly newly trained troops. They would start to jump from their ragtag bunch of Tb3, and some of them were lucky enough to have Lee 2 planes at a height of 1,800 feet, which is quite high up for a parachute operation.
Right.
And Soviet parachutes were designed for the troops to drop fairly slowly and controlled, which I might touch on a future episode. So they would eventually start to pop through the clouds, and then as they're slowly descending near the town of Dudari, they would start to see one of the columns of the 19th Panzer Division passing through the area, and the 19th Panzer would see these paratroopers dropping from the sky very slowly and unleash every single MG, autocannon and rifle, submachine gun, pistol up at the air to meet them.
Jesus Christ.
So the 5th Airborne Brigade would suffer around 50% casualties, being either dead or captured immediately upon landing. Some troops would even land on top of the on top of the column.
Luck 0.
Yeah. So out of the initial jump, only around 150 paratroopers would actually manage to rally themselves together and withdrew to the forest near the area of Grushov. Yes, sorry.
That's all right.
The confusion and poor navigation of the pilots, as I mentioned, would see most of these troops not only dropped on top of the 19th Panzer Division, but also over a gigantic area. In fact, some pilots were so confused on what they were doing, they even dropped their sticks of paratroopers behind their own lines, so they wouldn't even make it to the fight.
Quite phenomenal.
Yeah, so things aren't going terrifically well. The third would also see themselves considerably scattered, and again would be met by immediate resistance by German troops upon landing. This time, however, it would be by the 34th Infantry Division, so they would face a little bit of a better opportunity than the 5th Brigades. However, as soon as upon landing, they were cut off completely, suffering tremendously high casualties, and they effectively scrapped all of their objectives, and the only objective for them was to survive. The 1st Airborne Brigades, however, would have the best time and the best of luck. They would drop west of the town of Peccary, and they would meet little resistance in the area. And in fact, immediately after landing, they managed to set up a defensive area and clear several landing strips for troops from the 2nd and 4th Guards Air Landing Brigades. And they would receive quite a lot of heavy equipment from these air landing brigades. One of my sources said to receive some light tanks. However, I don't see that being possible, and none of the rest of my sources seem to confirm that.
I'm just trying to think what sort of aircraft would drop, like be able to carry a tank, and I can't think of anything Soviet.
I can think of one.
Go on.
Tb3.
Oh well. I've never seen. I mean, I don't know if we're going to discuss this later. I mean, I've seen the T-37s strapped to the underside of the Tb3. I can't imagine like something like a T-70. That'd be a bit much, but it
would probably be if they did drop these tanks, or tankettes more like. They probably would have been T-37s and T-38s.
I mean, I know that T-37s and 8s were used up until 1944. Funny enough, in another big river crossing in, I think it was in Poland, and yeah, it was the last time that they were used in their proper amphibious role. So I suppose it's not too much of a stretch to think 43 being used then. Yeah.
So yeah, they would receive the best of luck from their operation, and they would eventually actually be reached by Soviet troops crossing the river and breaking out of their pockets on the 27th, after sustaining quite severe heavy German counterattacks trying to quell their pockets.
Yeah.
After 2 months of fighting the Germans on the bend, the Germans would push Soviet troops back across the river using large elements of the 4th Panzer Army and the 8th German 8th Army.
Yeah.
However, this would prove to be a bit of a detriment to the Germans, as with them reallocating troops to crush the operation in the Dnieper Bend, that would ultimately lead to the Soviet forces being able to recapture the city of Kiev.
Right.
Without much of a fight. They would fight in Kiev for, I think it's, maybe wrong, but they would fight in Kiev for about a week. And again, since they captured Kiev, guess what the Germans had to do? They had to retreat from the Dnieper. So, objective-wise, did they secure their objectives? Yes and no. Did they sustain terrifically high casualties? Yes. Out of the 7,000 paratroopers dropped, only around 2,300 would survive this operation.
Jeez, that's heavy.
So that is crazy high attrition rates.
Yeah, it's not bad.
Yeah. That would be the last major airborne operation against the Germans. However, for the remainder of the war, airborne forces would still keep quite active, if not quiet. So with the Germans on the retreat and the rapid advance of Soviet airborne forces, the opportunity for major drops would be very limited. However, with the Dnieper and the Vyazma operations experience, where large drops conducted, there would be drops by Soviet paratroopers almost every single night. These wouldn't be large drops, they would be drops of specialists and teams of Soviet paratroopers to help resupply partisans, to provide partisan groups with instructors, commanders, specialists such as medics, snipers, engineers, sappers, and they would parachute behind enemy lines and carry out sabotage operations, quite similar to how SAS and Commando raids were conducted by the British during the Second World War. So, to me, that is one of the more interesting facts from the Soviet airborne forces.
It's interesting. I mean, when we look at, as you say, like we look at Western Europe and the airborne units are used as predominantly, essentially, light infantry that can be dropped anywhere. But the Soviets do a bit of that, like we've been discussing. But this idea that actually we can use them as specialists to get high-value people where we need them to secure or destroy or provoke a particular area. We don't need a lot of them, but you just get them in, and job done. It's very clever, very, very clever.
Yeah, when they provide these operations, they would actually be tremendously successful in conducting them, even to the point that the small glider fleet that the Soviets had would actually get mostly used up by supplying partisans with troops and supplies. Because if you can imagine, it'd be a lot easier for them to drop a glider.
Yeah.
Admittedly, they'd be pretty small gliders, but it'd be easier for them to drop a glider than clearing out large landing zones to drop the same amount of munitions.
Yeah.
However, small-scale tactical drops would still be conducted, most notably at battalion level and smaller. These would be included in Bulgaria, Königsberg, and many others.
Okay.
However, most of the time, they would actually be landing back in their own lines because of the advance of the troops on the ground. Yeah. So the ability of them to be exploited was becoming not tremendously effective. However, it was debated quite several times that they should be used on the advance to Berlin. However, the opportunity was never seized.
Sure.
However, in 1945, with the invasion of Manchuria being planned, the return of large-scale Soviet airborne operations would be seen, and the airborne divisions that were formed would actually get a chance to conduct airborne operations in Manchuria against the Japanese, where they would provide a rapid advance, shock and surprise opportunities against the Japanese, and allow for an almost leapfrog opportunity where I would essentially see the Japanese Kuomintang army collapse. So now we've talked about the main body, the VDV, let's take a look at something that is frequently, in my opinion, quite a lot of the time misquoted, and that is the Naval Airborne Forces. A lot of the time people, if they do have any knowledge of the Naval Airborne Forces, they tend to regard them as, oh yeah, it must have just have been a naval infantry brigade or something along the lines. However, the Black Sea Fleet would play into it quite extensively. I know that the Baltic Sea Fleet did also have a small paratrooper detachment. However, I have not been able to find any information in regards to them. So if anyone does find any information in regards to them, I am all ears. So the VDV would not only be the only Soviet airborne forces, as I mentioned, the Navy and as well as the NKVD would raise their own small airborne forces. However, again, I haven't been able to find much about the NKVD detachments, except that it is assumed that they were to be used in high-profile assassinations of German and collaborating officials.
Interesting.
However, again, the sources are quite grainy on that aspect.
Yes. So
the Black, Northern and Baltic Sea Fleets would all form special reconnaissance detachments, and every single one of them would practice parachute operations as well as submarine operations, albeit they would be on a very small scale, quite similar to SAS operations, where you would be dropping a team of 5 specialists behind the German lines into Norway or to support operations somewhere to conduct smash and grab operations where they'd be extracted by naval PT boats later on. However, as I mentioned, the Black Sea Fleet would form their own parachute detachment that would be separate from the typical fleet reconnaissance detachments. So quite creatively, the Black Sea Fleet's parachute detachment was called the Special Purpose Parachute Group of the Black Sea Fleet Air Forces.
That just rolls off the tongue.
Yeah, just rolls off completely. So 2 weeks before the Odessa amphibious landings, so if you look at the Black Sea Fleet, you have the city of Odessa, which was under siege, and in order to help relieve this siege, an amphibious operation was planned from the 3rd Marine Regiment to attack Romanian lines near Odessa to help relieve an area of siege. So the Black Sea Fleet High Command came up with this amazing idea. Why don't we drop our own paratroopers behind the lines? But we don't have any paratroopers. So in a space of about 2 weeks, they decided to form a parachute detachment. They would also take volunteers. This would be formed exclusively of volunteers. No one would be told, okay, yeah, Jimmy for the boiler room of the Paris Commune.
When you jump, do you bend your knees? Yes, good, you're going in the airborne.
yeah, exactly. So this would essentially start off as a very small detachment of 23 men. Most of these would have parachute experience through the Osavai team and Soviet sports parachuting.
Yeah.
And most of them would also come from the 62nd Black Sea Fleet Fighter Brigade. So they were all at least had some modicum of knowledge when it came to aircrafts and hopefully
they also sound like they're more elite when it comes to like their abilities. Like,
however, as I mentioned, most of these volunteers had to have this Osavai team parachute training, or at least seen a parachute before. However, for some of them, They volunteered never seeing a parachute before or knowing what a parachute was. So during this 2 weeks of training, because it's quite a condensed training package to get these newfound marine paratroopers up to scratch, they would focus exclusively on combat skills such as shooting, hand-to-hand fighting, and demolition tasks, rather, like I mentioned, rather than rehearsing jumps. So they would only go through the one jump and the one jump only. So listen to this. I shall say this only once. On the night of the 23rd of September 1941, a single Tb3 bomber, again Tb3 bomber, with 23 naval paratroopers, with only 2 weeks of training, and like I mentioned, some of them have never seen or used a parachute ever before, would drop. The LZ was chosen to be near the Agilik estuary near Odessa, which would also be very close to a very busy logistical intersection, which would allow them to carry out all of their objectives within a very close area. So the landing zone was very well chosen. So that would allow them to destroy communications lines, disrupt the logistical supplies getting to the front line, and the prevention of troops reaching the front line. But they would also be far enough back for them to play havoc with the remaining headquarters detachments that would be confronting the troops landing on the beaches. So just before the jump, the wind would change and blow them slightly off target, and that would also that would force a portion of the paratroopers to actually land inside the estuary. With this setback, that would come at a cost of 10 men.
But just drowning?
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah, essentially drowned. One of them, however, would land on the opposite side of the estuary. However, he would be captured by the Romanians and killed. So they would perform exceptionally well fighting against the 15th Romanian Infantry Division. And they performed so well, in fact, that the Romanians reported several hundred paratroopers with tanks and motorcycles operating in their rear.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
So
I have some Romanian friends who are very, they like to defend their part of history. But that is just brilliant.
yeah. So 13 into several hundred.
It's the gummy puppin scene from The Longest Day. Like, oh my god, we're being dropped on the parachute. Yeah, that's amazing. That's quite amazing.
Yeah. So they would perform exceptionally well. And it would actually give birth to a story and a legend known as the Battalion of Four, which would see one of the members ordered the Order of Lenin and 3 awards of the Order of the Red Banner.
Wow.
So they done exceptionally well in the rear of the 15th Romanian Division.
Jeez, yeah.
So going on to October 1941, the detachments, with their success and meeting up with the 3rd Marine Regiment that was landing, the detachment would be grown to the size of a company by October 1941, and they would see excessive fighting in the defence of Sevastopol during the siege. They would see very, very heavy casualties during the first assault. So much so that they actually had to merge with the gunners of the 35th Coastal Battery in order for them to still be combat effective. They would also be used to cover the retreat and the evacuation of one of the airfields. Again, forgive me if I say this wrong, the Chersoneos airfield, where there'd be assisting and covering the retreats of the aircraft taking off, taking VIPs and supplies and files away with them. So after the last Lee 2, the DC-3 would take off from the airfield. They would go on to defend the airfield through from the 1st to the 2nd of July, where they would actually come under attack from the 800th Brandenburg Regiment's 2nd Battalion, the 6th Company. So these were essentially the special forces of the German army.
Yeah.
So if you don't know much about them, they would frequently dress in enemy uniforms and try and sneak behind enemy lines and sow havoc. Very well trained and very elite troops.
Honestly not too hot on the German side of things, so that's quite interesting. Yeah,
that's why I painted the picture for you. And they would also come under contact by Georgian volunteers from the group Tamara as well, and light tanks. So they're getting pretty heavily outnumbered from this company of, albeit some veteran paratroopers, some newly trained paratroopers, and coastal battery gunners. They would, however, fight admirably. They would fight pretty well, fighting off against light tanks, special forces, infiltrators dressed in Soviet naval uniform, who tried to get into their lines. However, they quickly realised a very good way to determine who was friend and who was foe, as all of the infiltrators were cleanly shaven and washed very well, as opposed to the paratroopers who had been fighting tooth and nail in the Battle of Sevastopol. So
it's such a small oversight, but it makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
So they would also come under naval attack from troops landing in small boats that they would then later use and capture and then reuse to perform their own independent evacuation from the area and from the Crimean Peninsula.
Wow.
So yeah,
they were really in the thick of it, weren't they? Like here, there, everywhere, dropping from the sky, speedboating off in style, as it were. Bloody hell! Yeah, it's quite an amazing little story.
Yeah, and completely, it is for a company level of troops. They performed exceptionally well. So after Sevastopol, the unit was reformed again from more volunteers up to company strength again. This would be the second formation of the unit. They would then be used in a planned raid on the Maikop airfield, which was providing quite a lot of the fighter cover over the local area. And the VSS, the Soviet Air Force, was finding it very hard to actually secure air supremacy in the region.
Yeah.
So their goal would be to land at the airfield and destroy and damage as many fighters as possible and the infrastructure that was there. So 38 troops would drop during a bombing raid of the airfield. So you'd have a fleet of bombers that would go in first.
And then,
and in the midst of these bombers, you would find two or three transport planes. Instead of bombs, they've got angry Russian men with knives, guns, and grenades.
I was going to say, I think that might actually be worse than the bombs, you know.
Yeah, you can run away from a bomb. Well, if you're lucky, but try running away from
Ivan,
your very angry Russian naval paratrooper.
Yes. Wow.
So 38 troops would drop onto the airfield during the bombing raid, and they would proved to be very, very, very effective during this raid. And they destroyed a lot of the base's infrastructure. So that includes fuel trucks, ammunition, bombs, etc., as well as 13 fighters, and seriously damaging 10 more. And the raid would last a total of 40 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah, so it really was a smash and grab operation. They would then withdraw and retreat up to the high mountain ranges, where they would link up with partisan units operating in the area, and then they would be evacuated by U-2, not U-2 spy planes from the Cold War, but the venerable Po-2, as it's frequently known as.
Yeah.
Their final assault would not be as successful. However, they would still conduct themselves very well. On the 4th of February 1943, to support the Novorossiysk landings, the company now would see itself landing at, again, pardon me if I butcher this, Vasilievka and Glebovka, where their aim would be to capture and destroy the remaining 10th Infantry Division's headquarters elements. However, a couple of days prior to the jump, the HQ elements had moved from the area and they were nowhere near the drop zones. And the local forces into the area were very deeply entrenched. So the paratroopers would see heavy losses during this operation. Out of the 57 paratroopers landing, only 28 would actually return back to their own lines. The paras would, in a space of 1 month behind the remaining lines, destroy 1 heavy gun battery, 3 mortar batteries, over 220 infantry, as well as several vehicles and machine gun posts.
Wow, it's quite impressive.
Yeah. If anything, these troops are very impressive.
It seems to me that the Soviets really missed the ticket, like deploying more of their paratroop forces in this manner. The idea of like almost like roaming bands of, you insert the paratroopers where you want them, they destroy it, then they get extracted. I feel like that would have been an incredibly efficient way of disrupting the enemy's rear.
Oh yeah, I mean, effectively, you would have partisans operating in the rear of the German army for quite a significant part of the war and resistance movements. However, when you've got paratroopers operating behind your own lines, that is a very different opponent that you're going to be fighting.
Silly as it sounds, like even psychologically, I think the idea of trained paras being the ones that are potentially roaming around and causing havoc, as opposed to an armed mercenary band, essentially, I think that can be highly psychologically damaging for the enemy. So.
Oh yeah, completely. And not only that, they'd also, I mean, as we saw in the Vyazma operation and later on in the Dnieper operation, they would divert tremendously high numbers of enemy troops to try and quell these small bands, or not small bands, but these paratroopers who were surviving, clinging on by the skin of their teeth. Blowing up bridges, destroying tanks, transports, kidnapping soldiers, taking prisoners.
It's quite amazing.
Yeah, so the naval paratroopers' final battle in the Black Sea would be a fierce one, even though they didn't actually conduct any jumps during this time. They end up fighting on the Kerch Peninsula to help liberate it, where they'd be used in a marine role.
Right.
However, they would be upgraded to the size of a battalion, so there's quite a lot of them.
Okay.
However, they would perform quite admirably fighting on the Kerch Peninsula alongside the 2nd Guards Rifle Division. So like I mentioned, they would fight with great pride and effectiveness. After the Black Sea campaigns, they would eventually see themselves disbanded, along with a lot of the specialised Black Sea fleet units, such as the Fleet Reconnaissance Detachment of the Black Sea Fleet and the Azov Flotilla.
Yeah.
However, with the forces slowly, steadily pushing on, they would get amalgamated into either Marine reconnaissance detachments of Marine rifle brigades, or later, if they chose to stay in their more special forces role, they would see themselves employed as part of the Danube Flotilla Reconnaissance Detachment, which was the successor to the Black Sea Fleet's Special Reconnaissance Detachment.
Wow, okay.
And yeah, and the Danube Flotilla would fight all the way up the Danube from Belgrade, Bucharest, and ended up, I believe they ended up fighting near Prague as well. However, I'm not sure about the Prague offensive. And then after the war in Europe, they would then get sent off to Manchuria again and fight in the Amur Flotilla's Special Reconnaissance Detachment, where they would kick ass and take names in Manchuria against the Japanese.
Wow. These guys are, like here, there, everywhere, and they sound like they really, they should be remembered as proper soldiers and heroes, like genuinely, like doing some badassery.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to see it. That's why I took such a high interest in it when I first started reenacting.
Yeah.
Because you always heard about, like, people would always talk about, oh yeah, like, oh, who was it that started paratroopers? Oh yeah, it was the Soviets, wasn't it? But like, I don't think they did anything with it. So I did some.
Yeah, everyone thinks of like Germany early war and then America and Britain late war. So yeah. I mean, I didn't know any of that really. I've got a keen interest in aircraft, so I'm familiar with Tb3s and Li2s and things like that. But you know, putting it in the context of like the paratroop role and thinking of Tb3s being used as paratroopers aircraft up until that date is quite something, and something that I'm not sure every one of our watchers, viewers, listeners will know is, unlike the Dakota, the Li2s, which had a door and, you know, the paratroopers are inside until they physically jump, you know, a Tb3, the paratroopers have to crawl along the route of the wing and essentially slide off the wing to do their jump. It's such an old-fashioned and antiquated thing, and the thought of doing that in 43, or the thought of doing that at all, is terrifying.
Yeah, it's kind of terrifying, and in some instances they would even it's been noted that in some instances they would jump from the bomb bay.
Really? That's insane. Because I mean, I know that when the British paratroopers were practicing, they dropped from Armstrong Whitworth Whitley's, and they dropped from like a circular hole that was in the bottom of the airframe. But they found that lots of the paratroopers were dying, and they didn't know why until they realised that as they came out the aircraft, the slipstream would pull the para rearwards, and they'd smack the back of their head on the aircraft. And I can imagine the same sort of problems being encountered dropping from a Tb3's bomb base off that.
Yeah. Again, I don't think it was a popular method. However, it was used a few times. I mean, that isn't even the craziest methods of dropping troops. As I mentioned to you in Messenger when we were discussing the subject, during the Winter War and some of the operations, airborne operations that they carried out, they didn't even give the paratroopers parachutes. Instead, they decided to just drop them into snowdrifts, very large and deep snowdrifts, where they would just go straight into the snow. And supposedly it worked quite well. There was very little casualties due to it.
In the Soviet Union, you don't need parachute. Parachute needs you.
Yeah. Even during the Dnieper offensive, they even experimented, again, not giving some paratroopers parachutes, but instead dropping paratroopers the same way that they were dropping their equipment in bales.
Oh no.
Yeah, so
Oh
you get these
no.
giant bales of straw and padding and stuff, and you'd have a
That's
couple of guys
that's
inside each
almost
bale.
like from a cartoon. I can just like see limbs like hanging out of it, and oh no,
Yeah.
that's awful.
However, it's been noted that when the troops did try and get out of these bales, the Germans were looking at these bales thinking, oh yeah, it's just dropped some ammunition, and then they started like seeing them getting cut open from the inside, and like people were starting to climb out. So they
Very
didn't
green
last
in the
too long.
face, I'm sure, from rolling off in a bale.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah. So again, there's really crazy experiments that they were doing, and it's maybe a subject I can talk about in the future.
Yeah.
Especially pre-war. Some of the pre-war stuff is really
I think that the
smoking
pre-war
crack level.
experiments are subject onto themselves. I mean, we've already hinted at the tanks being dropped and
yeah.
being dropped without any parachutes. I think maybe quackery of the 30s could be a could be a good subject.
I didn't even mention the flying tank.
Yes. Flying tank is very famous.
Yeah.
Completely ludicrous, but hey,
Yeah.
you know.
I mean that's my little subject.
Wonderful.
Hold
I learned loads. That was great. I really enjoyed that. I think we should have a quick tea break, edit this out for the viewers, and then come back because I need a good cup of tea.
I need something as well. I've run out of water, and my missus has made us bug mix. So
Oh,
I think that's
well,
a
we'll
plan.
be right back after these messages.